Louis-Philippe as well for organizing this very nice conference, and with all these nice colleagues and faces, which I think we're starting to have very nice discussions already. So I'm sorry for shifting the topic and also the title of the presentation, which is a little bit different than the plan. The plan was doing an empirical test for the Posinet index, including fiscal policies. But then I changed my mind to actually disentangle the Posinet index with all the variables that are inside the Posinet index to have a little bit more sense of what's happening within the business cycles, right? So the title of the presentation is Once a Fiscal Swallow Does Make a Summer, for some kind of obvious reason that you're going to see in my conclusions and my results. This is an empirical test for actually the US economy, which is a work in progress that I'm doing with Ettore Gallo, which is also here today. So here's the contents of my presentation. I will start with my motivation and research goals, then show you data and methods. I'm going to show you some empirical results using a structural VAR model, and then go into the conclusions. As we are all aware about what we have experienced in recent decades, at least in high-income countries, is a development of stagnant real wages as well as productivity. The solution, according to mainstream economists that rely on neoclassical approaches, actually to solve the problem of obviously fostering productivity growth, and this would then feed back to the growth rate of real wages, and the problem would be then obviously solved. Recently, also the ECB in Europe has been arguing that in order to deal with productivity growth and then give a boost to real wages, we should also deal with monetary and fiscal policies. However, the way they argue about this is actually to deal with supply side policies in particular, and these, as post-Keynesians, I think we all disagree with. We can also discuss that based on the seminal paper of Steve Fasari and co-authors published in 2020, where he and the co-authors say that what actually boosts output and potential output is actually demand trajectory. Okay, as the neoclassical argue, if we make a productivity grow at a higher pace, we will also experience an increase in real wages. However, this is obviously not the case that has been observed in last years, and this is particularly not the case from 1979 until 2020. You see here data from a FRED database of a non-farm business sector, which is the data that actually the Federal Reserve uses to discuss productivity and wages. Here, wages, we have obviously productivity is per hour worked, not by employment, and real wages are real hourly compensation of the same type of sector, so non-farm business sector, all workers. Okay, so how can we actually, if we are all post-Keynesians here in this audience, how can we actually boost productivity? We know that from a Cadorian perspective, we can boost productivity, increasing components of demand, and in empirical terms, we have the contributions by Matteo Delady and co-authors, so Santiago Ganna and Claudio Fontanari, who have shown at the global level that if you increase autonomous demand components, in particular government expenditure and export, you can contribute to the increase in productivity. Obviously, in that paper, since they are considering the Caldorian perspective and they want to make a connection between the Caldorian perspective and the super multiplier approach, what they are trying to see is the relationship between autonomous demand and and labor productivity. However, they do not consider, obviously, wages and monetary policy in their contribution. Then, very recently, Claudia Fontanari, which was one of the ladies co-authors in the previous paper published in economic modeling just weeks ago, a paper showing that actually higher wages are able to boost labor productivity itself. So what we should be doing in terms of policy is actually, while doing policies boosting aggregate demand, also benefiting, trying to take care of the labor share through institutions, obviously. Okay, so taking these two contributions seen together, the first aim of this contribution is actually to assess concomitantly the interaction between monetary and fiscal policies in determining labor productivity. And the second goal is actually to assess the role of monetary policy and fiscal policy determining labor productivity through wages. And in that, we split between nominal wages, price level, and also real wages, because as you're going to see, you're going to estimate the different types of models. So the main research goal of this paper actually became making the lady meet the lady, because maybe they haven't met before. So the lady and co-authors, the first one, which I mean is the paper with Santiago Gana and Claudia Fontanari, which discussed the Caldorian perspective of demand boosting productivity. And the second delayed is the delayed that discusses the cost channel of monetary policy, price puzzle, and the effect of monetary policy on distribution, together with Antonino Lofaro, Enrico Sergio Levrero, and Maria Chiara. Okay, so the variables of this structural VAR model are the federal funds rate, also the 10 years bond rate for the US, obviously. This is all quarterly data. Real wages in real hourly compensation for workers non-farm business sectors. Then the nominal wages taken from the OECD database, CPI, Consumer Price Index, government consumption and expenditure, and gross investment. In this, it's not included, obviously, transfers from the government nor taxes. And last but not least, labor productivity in output per hour worked for all workers, non-farm business sectors. As usual, we estimate a structural VAR model. To do so, we first estimate a reduced form VAR, which can be summarized in equation 1. Then we can obtain the structural model as in equation 2. I'm not going to bother you with this very boring boring things, but in order to obtain a structural model, what we have to do is actually what we have to do is to impose an identification strategy in the matrix V0, right? So we estimate different types of VAR models, including our different equations. To do so, we rely on a Cholesky decomposition, which is simply this triangular matrix that you see here. And we order the federal funds rate, or alternatively, the government 10-year bond rate at first, to take into account the endogenous money approach, in which the central bank is able to set the interest rate at a level that it decides to set. Obviously, as a robustness test, we shift this kind of specification, including the interest rate at last in our identification strategy. When we consider real wages, we are the real wages after monetary policy. When we consider nominal wages, which is W here, we order W first, following the works of the lady and co-authors, the one with Maria Chiara and Enrico Sergio, that show that there's you can observe a price puzzle following an increasing interest rates. Okay. So first, I'm going to show you the results of forecast error variance decomposition. These figures basically tell you how much of the variance of each variable can be accounted for structural shocks in other variables. And this basically helps you to argue if also your identification strategy is correctly assumed or not. So if the assumptions that are implicit in your identification strategy are correct or not. Okay, so what you see in the graph is that the federal funds rate, the variability of it is basically exogenous, as we could have imagined, and explained only by itself and very little by government expenditure, but really very little. Whereas government expenditure follows kind of the same pattern, but is partially influenced by the interest rate. This is something that we, not Sapiens, but classical Keynesians have long discussed, which is the fact that actually the transmission channel of interest rate actually passes through the autonomous demand channel, and one of the autonomous demand components is obviously government expenditure. In another paper, we discuss which of the components are mostly affected, and we find that residential investment is the component that is mostly affected by interest rate, but this is not enough to say that the other components are not affected. Then this also shows that the variability of real wages can be explained by structural shocks on itself, but also on government expenditure and a little bit by productivity. Whereas the variability of productivity is mainly affected by real wages, which is something that Claudia Fontanari argues, and government expenditure, which is something that Claudia finds with her co-authors. Okay, when considering the government bond rate, the results remain basically unchanged, so I'm not going to take too much time on that. Then the second kind of specification, we split real wages into nominal wages and the CPI, which is based on the paper of Maria Chiara, Matteo, and Enrico Sergio. And in doing so, we can argue that nominal wages are basically explained by themselves, obviously, because determined by obviously institutions and bargaining power of workers and structural parameters of this economy, but also by structural shocks on government expenditure, and a little bit by the CPI, as workers usually try to maintain their purchasing power during the business cycle, and very, very little by productivity. Well, interest rates are basically not influenced by other variables except for itself and also wages. So the central bank reacts to increases in wages. Whereas the CPI can be explained by itself and basically wages, which is something very plausible as well, and very little by increasing government expenditure. So government expenditure is not determining the variability in the price level. Government expenditure, on the other hand, is determined by itself and by very little by the interest rate again, and almost not that much by nominal wages. Whereas productivity is basically determined by wages, government expenditure, and itself. Okay, this is just to show that using the government bonds, 10-year bond, the results do not change. So now going to the more interesting results, to the impulse response functions. When you go to the first column, you see structural shocks in the federal funds rate, so monetary policy contractionary monetary policy shock. Second column, you see an increase in real wages. Third column, you see an expansionary fiscal policy. And last but not least, you see an increase in productivity, which is not that interesting. So what's the effect of productivity on the other variables? Okay, so first finding is something that it's rather not new. If you increase the federal funds rate, you decrease real wages. It's a transitory effect, but this can be explained by the fact that the shock in monetary policy itself is transitory. So it's as expected. When you increase interest rates, you decrease real wages as long as you keep increasing interest rates. If they return to the normal level, to the baseline scenario, obviously this effect is reabsorbed. Also, we can observe a negative and a statistically significant effect on labor productivity. Second interesting effect is that if you increase real wages, what you get is a persistent and statistically significant effect on labor productivity. The same applies using government expenditure. If you increase government expenditure, you both can increase real wages as well as labor productivity, which, interestingly, is not accompanied by an increase in the federal funds rate. What's even, at least in my opinion, we were discussing that last night with Antonino, which is an even more interesting result, which is something that I find that I was not willing to access this channel when doing this, preparing this work. What we find is that an increase in government expenditure actually leads to a persistent and statistically significant and important decrease in the 10-year government bonds rate, which goes in exactly the opposite policy implication tradition of, for instance, the German kind of tradition of the European Central Bank, which argues that in order to decrease the spreads, you actually need to do austerity measures. Actually, you need to do exactly the opposite, as has been recently shown in IMF reports as well. Okay, if you split the analysis again into nominal wages and the CPI, what you get is that if you increase nominal wages, you get a persistent and statistically significant increase in the CPI, which is rather obvious, because if you persistently increase wages, obviously CPI consistently increases at kind of same level, right? Well, the same thing happens with productivity, so you can boost productivity increasing nominal wages. If you do a contractionary monetary policy, what we actually get is, as expected, the price puzzle, which we should not be calling it puzzling anymore, since it's a kind of a normal result that we, every time we do empirical tests with contractionary monetary policy, what we find is an increase in the price level, which is also accompanied by an increase in nominal wages, since wage earners try to keep up their bargaining power, their purchasing power. Nevertheless, what actually happens, as we've seen in the previous slide, is that even though they increase nominal wages, if you consider the effect on the CPI, so in the general price level, they actually lose purchasing power since real wages go down. When we look at the effect of government expenditure, we get that an increase in government expenditure, so expansionary fiscal policies. Okay, thank you. We get that we experience a persistent and statistically significant positive effect both on productivity and on nominal wages. As before, the interesting thing is that when we do exactly the same exercise for the government 10-year bonds rate, the government bonds rate, different than the federal funds rate, has a persistent and statistically negative effect on labor productivity and nominal wages, and an increase in government expenditure persistently and statistically significantly makes the government bonds rate to decrease for all the 20 quarters analyzed, so 4 years. So it's permanently at a lower level if you see the fourth column, right? Okay, so going to my main conclusions and maybe some hints for future empirical analysis. What we get from this empirical test is that contractionary monetary policy tends to have adverse effects on real wages and also labor productivity, which is maybe not so much novelty. Expansionary fiscal policy yields persistent and statistically significant improvements on labor productivity, as well as on real wages, which is something that Matteo has found in previous empirical works. But also very interesting, as we were discussing last night, fiscal policy is not only able to boost productivity and real wages, but it's also able to reduce the government bond yield, 10-year bond yield. So this is in extreme disagreement with what the policymakers have been telling us to do. So obviously, there are some drawbacks of these empirical estimations. The first one is we do these empirical estimations for the aggregate economy. We could do this for sectoral analysis, especially especially considering the fact that actually Calder was talking about the manufacturing sector and only the manufacturing sector. So it would be maybe interesting to discuss the effects on productivity on the different sectors of the economy, especially considering the structural changes that have happened in the past years. Second, following also the previous contributions, other contributions by Matteo and co-authors, it would be nice to break down government expenditure into different types of components. And lastly, following the works of Antonino Lofaro presented at the conference at Bank of Italy and a recent paper presented together with Joanna Vrizza at the FMM, it would be also nice to evaluate these effects, considering the effect of monetary policy, taking into account the effect on the level of employment and the level of activity to see what would happen with the wage share, that puzzling effect with the wage share that we discussed in Rio last summer. So this is just my robustness test. I'm not gonna take too much of time to speak about that. Those are my references. I thank you for your attention and look forward for your comments. Thank you.